Welcome to K-Wave 6 Radio, your show for all things positive, with your host, Kirk Spencer. Seems to be that we just got Andrés on the line. So good morning, Andrés. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, Kirk, and thanks for inviting me again for this new edition of our talks about system theory of violence. I'm very happy to be with you and to restart the discussion.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I just was going to say that it's still a very necessary discussion because the concepts are still fairly new to any listener, and anything we can do to explain these concepts to the people who are listening is precious and marvelous for the people to understand how we can actually really defeat the system of violence.
Indeed. This is something I think I forgot to put in earlier, or on our earlier promotions for you, is that it's not just a discussion with you, you're actually trying to and working at getting rid of violence on a worldwide basis. So I'm very thankful for you for being here as the activist that you are and doing what you're doing. As a matter of fact, before you came online, I was telling people about the video that I posted about you and the commissioned art from the German government that caused such an uproar, and
yes,
using that as start for getting into sociology and working as you are right now. Would you like to elaborate on that one?
Yeah, that would be a nice starting point, because I really started early in my life. And this sculpture which I made, the concepts for the emancipation of violence were settled around 1983-84, when I first had a skull fracture and I was at hospital and I died. And this experience of dying from an accident and perceiving the difference between life and death is what made me understand how precious life is, first. Second, how easy it is to die. Third, how much a violent phenomenon like the fracture of a skull changes personal life. And from that point on, with the knowledge that I had acquired before at school, I was able to understand that violence is something that is much larger, much bigger than what any individual could cope and take. And interestingly, it was the hospital, it was the nurses and the doctors who got me back in life. I mean, I wasn't dead long, it was just a few seconds, but that was enough of an experience to understand how strong this impact is, to feel it in your own body, and to then be able to talk about these issues as being something very real, very practical, and not abstract at all.
Okay. Let me see. Actually, if you wouldn't mind, can you tell us a little bit more about, without getting too long about it, but the experience of that statue being put into the building? I thought the story was very enlightening, but also kind of humorous at the same time.
Yeah, that's true. It's very humorous, because what is not told in the newspapers, for example, there are newspaper articles about the way this sculpture went into the building, is the following. I've been talking to those 1,500 employees of that state building for 3 years, which was the time which was allocated to me to manufacture the sculpture. And during these 3 years, I've been talking to the employees, explaining to them what the sculpture will be about, that it will tell about life and that it will be a symbol of the emancipation of humankind from violence. And every time we would discuss these issues in the rooms with maybe 50 to 80 people, employees of the Institute, what would happen is that they all would say, well, Mr. Ginestet, you're a privileged mind, you're an artist, you are allowed to talk about these things and to think about them. But, We are just normal people. We just earn our money and make our bread rolls every morning and go to work. And we do not have this freedom that you have. And they said, well, if you think so, then, you know, what can I do? I'll just work on my way and try to tell you that you have a reason to seek freedom, that you have a reason to want to emancipate from violence, that you have a reason to discuss the issues that are presented in the sculpture, and we will see what happens. So every time we would have a discussion, we would talk about these issues, and they were well prepared. And the day the sculpture came into the building, what happened is that the emotional shock was enormous, because this sculpture is so beautiful. It's so nice to touch it. You know, I mean, it's such a giant and magnificent piece of art that you can get emotional about it and really happy, because it's something really beautiful to look at and to touch. And then that made them free. They really, they just cut all the ties and ropes that were binding them to the institution and just went off to an explosion of emotions. And, within half an hour, I had more than 1,000 people around me discussing with me the terms of emancipation and violence and all that.
Uh-oh.
That was Kirk. It went, it went into a direction, the whole discussion went on for a week. They made a spontaneous strike, and if you are a state servant in Germany, you are not allowed to strike. A strike is forbidden. It's something that if you are a state servant, you're not supposed to strike, and if it was massive, it was hundreds of them, it was more than 1,000 of them doing it, and they were all public servants, all under this convention, and all, had a binding by a contract, and they all could have been thrown out, which obviously didn't happen because it was so massive. And then the interesting thing is that they said, okay, Andrés, we have to discuss this. This is really important. It's more important than anything else in our life. And the directors of the institute, who were completely upset, they didn't understand anything about what was going on, said, okay, we will make a proper discussion and invite sociologists and literature professors into our discussion so that we have qualified people who will discuss with us about the concepts that are in this sculpture. And then these discussions were again hugely emotional and very satisfying, because in the room suddenly there were people, women, who would speak up in front of their colleagues. And I don't know if you can imagine what it's like if there are 800, 900 people in a room sitting, and suddenly out of the middle, a woman stands up and says, now you listen. I am a victim of violence. I have endured and suffered rape. This artist is absolutely right in what he says and what he does. And this, this moment, when you see this woman standing up and saying these things and, clearly advocating for the sculpture and saying, this is exactly what we need, this is exactly what this society needs. It has a blind eye, it doesn't want to look at the bad issues, and if we do not look at the bad issues, we'll never get rid of them. We have to solve the questions, and we have to be thankful to the artist. So, and this happened, at my very early age. It was 1993, so I was age 29. And this just gave me the courage then to go on and to do the sociological studies and all the other work which I did afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is amazing to see somebody stand up and just let it out that, yes, I am a victim. So many people don't want to actually admit to publicly that they were a victim of some sort of violence. Let me move on to, let's see, that quotation I put up in the invitation about from after Chicago. Would you like to elaborate on that one?
Well, the document which I presented at this NATO conference is a typical document which we, can only understand in terms of a scientific conceptual visualization. So it's just trying to make visible which are the possible alternatives if we use violence. And in the graphic representation, we have 3 examples. One sheet shows in which way the world would look like if we do not use violence, and then the other 2 ones are showing which way we would drive into if we do use violence as a mean of governance. Mm-hmm. And this is something that if I say that in order to get to a world in which the middle line, the middle curve gets effective, we shall behave as to reduce trauma influence on human social construction worldwide, then this obviously departs from my personal experience with this skull fracture, which was, by the way, extremely painful. I'm still suffering from it because it creates massive headaches. And then all the extrapolation which I was able to do, because I could see the suffering suddenly, once you have suffered so much, you can see the suffering in other people's eyes, you can read it in their faces, and you understand that something is wrong. And then you become aware of it, whether you want or not. You just feel it, you see it. So if I write that we shall behave as to reduce the trauma influence, then it is first of all because I have the personal experience of it, and second because I can make the extrapolation, because I can clearly explain how this affects not just a single individual person, but consistent critical masses of people within a society. And when I say that trauma influence has to be reduced on the social construction worldwide, then I mean the total amount of human behaviors that get deformed by violence. And this is not just many, it's really very many, Kirk. I mean, it's an amazing amount of behaviors that get deformed. Yeah? Most of the legal system components in any country, in any democracy, are issued as some form of dealing with the system of violence. So it's morals built up against violence. And these morals are morals. They are not adequate because they themselves are somehow also impregnated, colored, deformed by the system of violence. And when I say reduce trauma influence, then I mean it in very technical terms. I want to be able, for example, to read it in the blood. So I want to make sure that the trauma influence really does not affect our genes, that it does not inhibit our epigenetics. And for this, I really need to be able to have a blood sample and to measure, what I'm looking for within that blood sample. And this is not talking about morals. This is not discussing legal systems. This is looking at reality and not what it should be. It's completely different. The approach is completely different, and the way we get there is also completely different. This is not having any authority telling other people what they have to do. It's just building up the critical mass of people doing the right thing so that we can be sure, because we can measure it in the blood, that it is not there anymore. And then all the other things like laws and moral and the way people behave in a society adapts. From the moment on, the influence of trauma is reduced consistently.
Let me ask you something here real quick, if you don't mind me interrupting here. Because I'm listening to what you're saying, and it's reminding me of what I've said or heard from other scientists who speak about there is memory in cell growth. In other words, even to the point that we pick up to some degree the memories of our own parents, and we carry them forward without ever having to be taught. In other words, let's give an example of a person who is born to a woman, and for some reason or another, the child has to be adopted out to someone else. That child has the memories of its parents, even though it never knew its parents. Is that something that you're talking about?
Yeah, that fits very well. I mean, there is a lot of things that we do still not understand and that we still do not explain in scientific terms because research has not gone far enough. And one of them is linked, for example, to these cases where children are able to find their parents even though any kind of connection was cut off from their birth because they were given away or whatever. But it still happens that children find their parents and try to reestablish a healthy, relationship, which they may not manage to do because there are, if a mother, for example, gives a child away, there are really strong reasons for her to do it. It's not easy for a woman to just forget about a child.
No. We only have about 4 minutes before we go into our first break. Today we're only doing one break every half hour because we are going for 2 hours, and we do want to open up the phone lines. That was Andrés' suggestion in the second hour. So within the next, say, 3 minutes, Andrés, can you answer a question or elucidate on a question? Are you looking for or working for the elimination of all violence or at least manufactured violence?
No, I would say it's all violence because what it comes down to is, this is something very interesting because what we have discovered in scientific terms about violence is puts it very clear. We need to look at it from a victimological perspective. To any victim of any trauma, it is nearly irrelevant if the trauma is caused, in example, by a storm, by a fire, by a flooding, or by a human being. It makes a big difference regarding resilience and recovery. So being hurt by a human being is worse and makes things more difficult because it feels unnecessary, absurd, and really deeply hurting. Because, it's someone of your species, and you don't expect somebody of your species to do something horrendous to you, and yet it still happens in massive ways on all the planet. So, regarding resilience and recovery, it is obviously much better to focus on human-made violence, because that is the large amount of violence that is so absurd that it writes the codes of violence deeply into our behavior, whilst accidental violence due to natural catastrophes is easier to cope with because there is no applicable guilt, there is no person behind it with a will and an intention. So intentional violence is, in terms of resilience and cure, more important. But regarding the trauma side, it is not. So on the trauma side, and looking at it from a victimological point of view, the victim of a earthquake, of a volcano explosion, or of a human attack, is always a victim and has exactly the same quality. The trauma operates in the brain with the same intensity. And from that point of view, I would say regarding trauma reduction, we have to have a very large scope and look at every form of trauma. And then when we look at the aspect of resilience and recovery, there we have to make a difference. Kirk?
I'm sorry, I had muted my mic.
Okay.
I forgot I did it. Yeah, I do that just so I can cough without anybody hearing me. Anyway, we're going to take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk, or we're going to have Andrés talk about his latest paper, which we'll talk about when we get back. And we have 2 minutes, so stay tuned, go get your cup of coffee, and we'll be right back.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Batsiyon Saskain-Sachs of www.bat-zion.name, N-A-M-E. You're listening to K-Wave 6 Radio with Kirk Spencer.
Hi, this is Pat Kammer, author of Love's Voice Changes You, Book 1. And I now have Book 2, which is called Hello Awesome, Message from Spirit in Pat's Patters. Buy your book from Amazon.com.
Do you get writer's block or tongue-tied when you try to write or talk? Need a wordsmith for a script, article, or research paper? Let K-Wave 6 Productions help you with all of your audio, visual, editing, and language translation needs for your business or hobby. Does the thought of creating a website give you chills? We also have webmasters to help you with all your website needs. Remember K-Wave 6 Productions, www.kwave6productions.tk, or email us at info.kwave6productions.tk.
Hi, this is Duke Mayo Rockefeller. Please check out my humanitarian organization, www.livechildlive.org. You are listening to K-Wave 6 Radio with our esteemed radio host, Kirk Spencer.
Well, esteemed radio host. I don't know about that one, but Mayhall is supposed to be on with us later on today, so we'll see how that goes. Anyway, before we get back into this, Andrés was telling me last week or the week before that he was supposed to be on a business trip to talk or at some conference or another, and they were going to put him into a room with the computer so we could do the interview, and then something else happened in his life, so I'm really thankful that he is here. Andrés, do you want to tell us about that new happy event?
Well, that is something very nice to do, yes. I have, well, let's put it like this. A new visitor on this planet made its way through to us, and it's my daughter. My daughter came on Monday 19th at 7:28 down to Earth and saw for the first time daylight, and it was a very nice event, a very happy one. It was not an easy birth because it was caused by some medical infection, but she's completely safe. She's a beautiful human being. She's a beautiful girl. She's wonderful. She's very everything, and now feeding well, growing up well, and I'm very happy to be able to tell everybody that life is such a pleasure and is so beautiful, and that it's worth going on, whatever the problems and difficulties are, and that every child deserves that we do whatever we can to make life beautiful for them, because that's what they deserve.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, you're planning not only just for general public as an activist, but for your own family as well.
That's it, exactly. Everything we do in our family, it's not me, myself alone. It's my wife and me who are committed. It's, my eldest daughter who is also working on the same issues now. And we are making a family effort. My mother participates in it too. It's several members of the family that are really engaged and working on a daily basis, so that we all together pull the strings that need to be pulled in a way that makes it possible for other people to understand the message and to discuss peace and nonviolence.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of peace and nonviolence, because unfortunately, Andrés and I love to talk with each other, and I really appreciate his friendship. But we're going to get back into doing the interview here. So I'm going to start with this. Andrés, there is a woman who you may know of. I don't know if you know her, but her name is Brigitte Gabriel, and she is very much an activist, especially, I think she was born into Islam, I believe. I'm not positive. But she is an activist pretty much against it, and especially against the violence. And I saw a video from her just recently where she was on a panel and they were talking about one particular subject. And the video didn't talk about her subject, but there was a student at this university who was dressed as most Middle Eastern Islamic students, well, young women dress, head covered and wearing basically something that looks like a robe, in my Western way of putting it. And she was saying that the majority of Islamic people or Muslims are nonviolent. It's just the radicals that are doing it, and why don't we address the nonviolent Muslims out there? And Brigitte Gabriel was saying, and I'd love to get her on the show to talk about this. As she said, I'm glad you brought it up. She goes, and I'm going to give it in short. She says, the pacifist people, the nonviolent people are great people, but the majority of people in Germany during World War II were not Nazis, but they didn't do anything. The majority of people in your native country, Spain, were not siding with Franco, but violence went on anyway. The majority of people in, I forget what country it is, Pol Pot, but the violence went on anyway. Because, yes, the majority of the people are kind and loving, but they didn't do anything. And this is the same thing that's going on in the world right now. You may not be a violent person, but if you're not standing up to say, no, enough, don't bring it here, then what happens?
Yeah, that is...
Well, let me use that just for something that you said in your last paper. And if you don't mind, I'll even make it available to people on my blog, if that's okay with you. What is the title of that one again? Islamic Fundamentalism and the Dialectic of Modern, what is that, Libre? Modernity, okay, yeah.
Modernity,
anyway.
Yeah. That is a document which is written by a different author. It's not myself being the author. It's somebody else who wrote it. Look at the title there. It should state who it was. But it's, I'm obviously collecting papers from many authors who all work more or less in the same direction and who are working on the same issues, which is to try to diminish the influence of trauma by, in example, understanding well what this is about.
Well, let's go into something that I admitted to you before that I didn't get a chance to read the whole document, but you'd mentioned in that talking about a rudderless society. In other words, we have been removed in many different ways from having a direction to we're just floating along whichever way the currents go. Would you like to start with that one?
Yeah, what is very important is that we have to make a distinction between peace and war along the lines of activity of people. In most cases, people are used to a certain level of violence because this level of violence is natural to them. They are born with it. So, for example, if you live in a society in which 80% of women get raped, then it is normal to live with raped women, and you get accustomed to it. And then if you have suddenly a surge of rape, and if this rape increases by only 5%, the 5% may be tolerable until 4.999%. But from the moment on they are 5%, they are not tolerable anymore, and something happens, and something changes, and some awareness gets given to it, and suddenly it's not okay anymore to rape the next woman, because people are tired of it. And this is what happens. You have critical masses of events which influence our day-to-day perception according to our inheritance. So if we inherit, as we've talked about it earlier in this radio show, from your parents some influences because your parents have gone through some trauma, and because going through some trauma, they have inherited maybe themselves some trauma from their great-grandparents or even earlier, and they go on living this trauma and they are reproducing the same pattern of behavior. So if you inherit that, you are likely to fall for a certain violence when this violence is offered, when it presents itself to you as an opportunity. And the less violence we have and the less trauma we have, the less it is probable, the less it is somehow likely that you will fall for that trauma and for that violence pattern, because it's not part of day-to-day normality. So, for example, if we compare the country which has 80% of women raped, and we compare that country with another country which has 20% of women raped, the average behavior of the people in one or the other country will very strongly depend on exactly those percentages. Now, it's not any variation of the percentage that will cause a major disruption, and then, for example, a major conflict. Major conflict will always go along with a critical mass of change. So in a society where 20% of women get raped, a 10% rise of rape will certainly cause a very strong move within that society. And what we want to say with this is that it all depends always, anytime, on critical masses. It's not an issue that can be discussed in singular cases. We have to look at the whole pattern of the total amount of violent behaviors within a society and how the percentage of violence is experienced in everyday life experience. And then we have to look where are the variations. And these variations are the ones that make the difference. And these variations then, for example, can be caused by external factors. So if you have a Muslim world in which a certain amount of trauma is tolerable and people live with it, and you add some trauma to it, like, for example, an unreasonable war, which will be led by any foreign country and will bring into the Muslim world a certain amount of trauma, then that certain amount of trauma can trigger major events which can then degenerate and become a generalized war for not only those two countries that are now fully developing that war, like, for example, the Iraq war in 2003, but even later. And from that moment on, it's the entire group, so it's the entire Islamic society that could become something more violent because the opportunity is presented. Very simple. The more pacific behavior happens and the more critical masses of interventions are built to pacify those societies, the easier it will be to get rid of the other violence which is within that society. But if there are, if you set the wrong signals, if you pull the wrong triggers, if you, for example, face them with a war that they do not deserve, be it Afghanistan or be it Iraq, I don't mind, we can name many conflicts of that kind. So then that is sufficient to build up the critical mass of opportunities for many, many, many Muslims who have inherited problems to just fall for the violence patterns.
Mm-hmm. Let me, only because we have to watch our time here, there are two things I want to address at one point here, just at one time, and it's still coming from the same paper. The Jacobin Reign of Terror, the start of terrorism, at least in the Western world, and I want to lump that together with Protestant, the origins of fundamentalism. Can you tie that together with what we're talking about here with Islam? Because it's obvious that they learned this from someplace.
Yeah, Islamic fundamentalism is just another type of any sort of fascism. Yeah, Nazis are also fundamentalists, and you find fundamentalists in every society. So they breed out of the average of all violence types, influencing the everyday violent pattern of behavior. So if there is a critical mass of, let's say, 60% of a population that, for example, knows battering, knows rape, knows sexual abuse because of personal experience, then that is sufficient to, for example, bring out a substantial group of people who are ready to do more. But if you reduce that level of violence and you have a totally pacified society which does not know rape, and then you bring people from other countries into that society who are completely used to rape, and you have both the people who are completely innocent to rape because they don't know it anymore, because it doesn't happen anymore, and you bring in those who are used to do it because they come from a country where that is normal, then there is obviously a conflict about to happen. And some women will get raped, and will be raped by not the people from the same country, but they will be raped by the people who are used to it, which is very simple. It's a very normal thing to happen. If you think about it, there is nothing wrong about it. If you grow up in a country where you have been born out of a rape, you are a victim in the first place, and the chances that you do something similar are much higher than if you are born in a country where these things do not happen. Full stop, that's all. So if we mix up both populations and we mix them up in a completely naive and innocent way, not looking at the mechanics of the system of violence, then we are bound to face some tragedies which we do not want to face. But what I want to state with this is that fundamentalism goes along the same way. So, for example, you may have a totally innocent and pacified society which is not aware anymore of these problems because they have encapsulated themselves with media and with their luxury and the comfort of their society. But some of the actors of then the privileged are doing some work for the privileges, and they're producing a war, for example, in order to get some oil, cheaper oil, and that makes them the profit, but makes also the people of these innocent people comfortable and nice. So, but suddenly some of the actors of these innocent are not that innocent, and they produce, let's say, a larger conflict, and we suddenly face then people out of those countries who have been bombed out because they get angry at us because, we have been so innocent. We thought that the petrol that we get at our gas stations comes from some Norwegian platform, and we didn't think that it maybe comes from Saudi Arabia or some other country which has been involved in a major conflict. And that makes us then totally, let's say, surprised, and we face then suddenly a violent surge, and we get called by our names, and they're telling us, hey, listen, you are causing harm to us. We are starting to hate you deeply, and we're going to eliminate you. We're going to eradicate you from a planet surface because you have been, just an itch for us, and you've been hurting us and causing us bad damage for so many time now. 20, 30 years, the last 20, 30 years have been filled with completely absurd and stupid wars which didn't need to happen in the first place if people had known about the system of violence. So, but these wars have happened, also with angry people who are getting every day more angry and have reasons to do so, because these minorities that build up fascist nucleus who then become fundamentalists and radicals, they build up very quickly as a reaction. So you have those in Islam building up due to all the pain, and because there is a sufficient critical mass of people there that are hurt enough to elevate the level of tolerance towards violence. So you have more violence happening, so you have more actors in the field, and you have a stronger minority, which is still a minority. As you said, Kirk, within the Nazis, it was the same. There were 5% at some point, and there were 10%, and there were 15%, and that was enough. 15% was enough to turn pages and to make the whole war, the Second World War, and all the horrors which went with it. But we have to see, still what I said, that there are some actors who make some profit with it. And also these minorities, also these people who are then radicals, they wouldn't be able to act unless somebody was investing some money in them to act. They get some money from somewhere. And there must be some kind of bias between money and trauma that leads to that kind of situation. I won't name names, but there is more and more people who are aware of these facts and who do some research and who start linking then the names. Like Isabella Loretani, who's a scientist in the United States and who has written about terrorism and its financial sources. And I think that it would be just easy enough to look, for example, about these financial sources of terrorism, and then understand that it's something very real that is happening there.
We're coming up on that second break, but let's go here. I'm thinking about what you're saying here, and I'm kind of wondering, this is just my thought, so it's not a statement, it's more of a question, because to a certain degree it sounds like being a social or having a socialist society, because you're talking about how in Saudi Arabia, and I think most of us know that there is a inordinate amount of wealth in the hands of just a few, while there are extremely many people that are living in either near poverty or close to it or whatever, but they're still struggling. Now, granted that I'm not talking about here, you're going to be guaranteed this wage, or you're going to be guaranteed you can just live and you don't have to do anything, because that actually diminishes the human spirit. But the argument that's going on in the United States about what is a living wage, in other words, when I work, can I get enough to live, not survive, but live? So is that idea of capitalism that's just gone awry? In other words, I have, and I'm going to have every house in every country, 747 for my private airline, and so on and so forth. Is that something that you could see as being an indicator or an engine for the violence in society?
I wouldn't say that it's inequality, in its mild form as we know it in Europe. If we look at the inequality in Europe, we have a 1 to 10 ratio, which means that the person who gets, the highest wages will get more or less 10 times more money than the person that gets the lowest wages. But if we look at the same ratio in the USA, we're talking about 347. I think it's something very different. So the richest person with the highest wages will get 347 times more money than the person earning the lowest wages, and that makes a big difference. And then we have, still another problem, which is more abstract, which is that wealth is being redistributed due to the not to the differences in wages and social inequality in day-to-day and livable terms, but we are talking about the more abstract fortunes of some people who have so much money on their accounts that any dollar that gets lent is in the end paid back to them and only them. And that's a very few. I mean, this is at the most 5,000 people on planet Earth who own, let's say, 80% of all the income of the planet due to the way the debt system is built up. And we are talking now here about something which can be changed very easily. I mean, why is it that these people are getting money, for not doing nothing? I mean, they inherit a fortune. This fortune is on an account, and they get paid for it. I mean, even a 1% interest for them is a huge amount of money, and they're not doing anything for it. So we have in Germany right now the case that the first banks have introduced negative income for these fortunes, which means that if somebody has a fortune of more than €500,000 on an account, he will be punished for not distributing the money and making something in society himself. So European banks are flooded with capital that they're not able to lend anymore. They can't get rid of it. So they have so much liquidity that they cannot pay the interests anymore of the big fortunes. It's at a point which is completely absurd. This happened for the first time in November 2014. For the first time in the history of German banking, German banks were stating that they had more liquidity than they had money lent out, money borrowed to other people, which is, something completely crazy. And here, we just need to, in fact, deal with the fact which is existing, which maybe had made sense for a while, let's say until 1980, but it's something that makes no sense anymore from 1980 on, and we should just stop it. It's very easy. We just have to make a little law and say that people who have big fortunes have to bring that money back into society. They can keep a part of it, because, I mean, how do you want to spend more than, I don't know, $5,000 per day? is that going to make you happy? I mean, it's ridiculous. No. Yeah, it's completely ridiculous. Are you going to eat a steak that is worth $5,000? Is that going to make you happy? I mean, if you can get a steak worth $100, is it going to be a much better steak because it's going to cost $5,000? Is that the luxury, these $4,900? Is that going to make you happier? I don't think so. Yeah. No. So at some point, it's something which is bound to common sense. I think that if these people have a little bit of common sense, I mean, they have sufficient power. They just can make a proposal. But this proposal, and here we have a problem, Kurt, needs to be embedded in a society that knows how to deal with the issues that we are discussing. And I don't see that. Not at the moment.
Yeah. We're going to take our second break here, and we'll be right back in 2 minutes, so that gives you time to run off and get your coffee or whatever else you need to do. And when we come back, I have 2 more questions that I'd like to ask Andrés. And then, with his permission, in about 15 or so minutes, we'll open the phone lines, and you can speak with Andrés. If you want to call in by Skype, there's a Skype icon on the homepage of Blog Talk Radio. Click on it, follow the directions, but don't do it right now. Or if you're in the United States, Canada, if you don't mind making a long-distance phone call, if you're outside of the country, the number is 347-677-0812. We'll repeat that later, but right now we're going to take our break, so stay tuned and we'll be right back.
Hey everybody, this is Suzanne Perry, founder of LoveIsN'tHurt.tv. You're listening to K-Wave 6 Radio.
Hi, this is Amy Young of JSJ Phone. We are providers of junior iPhone, iPad, iPod, also Samsung, Sony, Nokia parts and accessories at very good quality and low prices. We sell to individuals, and the companies have 3 to 5 days delivery time by DHL or UPS. We do delivery in 24 hours after payment confirmed. For more information, see our website www.jsjphone.com www.jsjphone.com. Contact me, Amy Young, mailbox emy@jsjphone.com or by phone 0086 13418696395 by Skype emy.yang2012.
Yes, honey. This is Marlo Wright of mbymarlo.com, and you're listening to K-Wave 6 Radio.
Hello and welcome back to K-Wave 6 Radio. This is Kirk Spencer, your host, and today my guest, if you haven't been here all this time, is Andrés Ginestet from Germany. I was about to say Alemania because I live in Mexico, and that's where they... Where does the word Alemania come in with Germany? How does that work anyway?
Well, that is something which comes from the Roman Empire, and when the Romans faced the Germanic tribes, they were dealing with a country which was called Germania, and the Alemanis in Latin were a tribe within those Germanic people. So in Spain, for example, where Spanish is born and developed, the Alemanes were a tribe that also invaded Spain from the north after the downfall of the Roman Empire. So the Los Alemanes, Los Vándalos, which were all sorts of Nordic violent tribes, were visitors in Spain for a while, and they all ended up in the northwest corner of Spain, which is nowadays Asturias and Galicia. And this is where you have most of the blonde and blue-eyed Spanish guys and women, which are all inheritors of those past invaders.
Got it. Okay. A little bit of history, even from me today. Before we continue on into this, I just want to say that the chat room is open, so if you want to communicate with me through the chat room, we can do that until we open the phone lines in roughly 15 to 20 minutes, and we'll let you talk with Andrés for at least 40 minutes, give or take. So anyway, before we continue, well, as we continue, there's 2 points that I did find in that same document. As you said, you're not the author, at least not all of it anyway. Two thoughts that came out, and like I said, I was scanning, so these things caught my attention here. It's talking about Christian fundamentalism and how it spread to Islam, and since they're all tied together, Western man, this is more of a question than it is a statement. Western man identifies with Islam's violence, and why? I have my own particular theory, but I'll let you run with that one.
Well, the identification is clear. I mean, violence is a pattern of behavior, and patterns of behavior can be identified like colors in a picture. You see it in the entire attitude of a population. You also see it in its cultural products and output. And in the end, it's a mirror. You recognize it because you have neurons, mirror neurons, and these mirror neurons reflect something that is deeply inside yourself that you know, because you know that it has been produced. Europe was filthy with violence, 300 years ago, with all the wars we had, and even 200 years ago. And we have been pacifying it, but the pacification process of Europe has lasted now since 1945, which means that the peaceful Europe we know is not a long-standing reality. It's a reality that is at the most 3 generations long. And 3 generations is not enough to erase the biological memories of the violence lived before. The violence lived before lasts for 5 generations. And this means that we have another 2 generations to go before we can say that we are clearly a non-violent population. So the fact that neurons are awakened is very easy to understand if we know that every population, every civilization has a memory that is not the individual but the collective memory, and that this collective memory is fed with the violence out of the past. And we have had really visceral violence in Europe. I mean, something that in other cultures has not been seen because those cultures didn't have the means to lead that kind of war, which has been, existing in Europe also thanks to the technological advances, like, for example, using gas in the First World War in the trenches, and killing people in such a stupid and absurd way. It's amazing how arrogant officers could be, telling to their soldiers that they had to stand, in the middle of that completely absurd battle where the soldiers would, even fraternize and try to break the rules of war at Christmas, and at least spending some hours together because they knew that they would have to kill each other the next day. But for that moment being, they would just talk to each other as human people and not treat the other one as the enemy. But these kind of totally horrendous scenarios are not that far away of us. We know them pretty well. And any form of violence that we face in other civilizations, like, for example, now in Islam, is very well known to us. We know what it can do, and we are obviously afraid of it because we know the advantages of being in a peaceful situation. We know that we haven't done enough to make this peaceful situation stable, and we know that we have to go further. And right now, there is also a fear that events could develop in a bad way, as if we didn't have lessons of the past, as if nothing of the past had told us how to do it better, which is not true. We have learned the lessons out of the past. We have developed much better skills. Maybe we're not sufficient people involved. That is maybe a problem. But I'm not even sure about that. I'm not clear. I wouldn't be able to say if we have a critical mass of people who are ready for peace or not.
I'm sorry, we're getting some feedback on the chat rooms. We're going to get there in just a moment. But I do want to ask you this, because while you were talking, I wrote down a note. I have to do that because I have too many things going across my mind at the time. Talking about the spread of violence, linking it to what you were just talking about and some things that we were talking about before our last break. The spread of violence is not something that necessarily has to be witnessed or experienced or even to be a product of that. I'm going to use Hitler, and of course we're going to come back to the Middle East for the same reasons, because Hitler made many let's say, references to the United States and how during the 1800s, how the United States actually treated the natives of the land and the people that were there before the Europeans came to be. And we spoke about this in our first interview, about how these societies, they didn't have jail systems, they didn't have massive amounts of anything that was negative, such as rape or killing or mugging and all these things. They were societies that lived and took care of each other. And your European comes along and says, "Oh, you're heathens, you're pagans, and we've got a better way of life." And nowadays, even for-profit prisons. So, but going back to Hitler and whatnot, Hitler made reference to the reservations, which is where he got the concentration camps from, about the forced, in the United States they're called mission schools, where they literally took natives, or we just call them Indians, some people do, whatever, took them from their families and taught them the Western ways, but still wouldn't allow them to be a part of Western society. What do you see, without me rambling on about that, how do you see that as being a part of the violent system that we have? Because obviously other people are learning from, we do something here, somebody goes, I like that, and I'm going to do that over here.
Yeah. Well, we have several factors which have an influence on what you're stating now. One of them is the globalization of media and information. So first of all, we are building up opportunities which are changing the way of understanding conflicts and the way of understanding the root of problems, which could be of consensus on all of the planet due to the fact that the information is accessible to everybody on the planet at the same time, simultaneously. Then we have another critical factor which plays a role in that, which is the factor of identity. And here we have identity conflicts which are set up together with the system of violence, because many identities and also many identity patterns are tied to the system of violence. So many identities are tied to violent behavior because I'm born into it, because my family tradition is of it. My father was a terrorist, my grandfather was a terrorist, my great-grandfather was a terrorist. In the end, we call them terrorists, they call themselves heroes and warriors, and they have a positive identification with this identity. And this is a problem which is a little bit more of a structural problem to the whole matter that we are discussing, because we have on one side a tendency of globalized values and of a globalized set of rules to which we would obey and to which we would have all access and that we all would work on. And then this creates, a much stronger discussion about identity, because if we have a common set of rules for all of humanity and everybody is somehow looking at these rules, discussing them, and these rules then through the narrative process, through the process of narration, and through the process of dialectic, become part of our everyday, because suddenly, even though we live in the Himalaya, we have to discuss something that some Western guy is stating, like myself, for example. I'm discussing issues like the system of violence and complexity, and I know that people in Nepal are reading my documents. So, why is somebody in Nepal reading my documents? Yeah, what kind of positive outcome will we have out of that? Who is doing it? For what reason? I have no idea. The only thing that I know is that these documents are being read in Nepal, and that is relevant because maybe that Nepalese person would be perfectly happy without knowing about what I write. But this Nepalese person is reading about what I write. So globalization is putting some sort of pressure on people of all the planet. And those who have then a weaker identity, and with a weaker identity I mean a identity that is bound to either an aggressive or a victimized behavior, fight even harder to make this the general rule. Why? Very simply, because it's an identity issue. If you do not have empathy, and if your brain has been damaged, and if that brain comes from a damaged brain which had been damaged in its time, and the damage is expressed in a loss of empathy which is caused by a chemical reaction on the epigenetics due to a trauma impact, like rape, like sexual abuse, or like war. Yeah? War can certainly, those children growing up right now in Syria, in those cities which are being bombed out by either Assad or the rebels, where these horrendous massacres are being created, where you have adult idiots cutting throats of other adult idiots who have allowed this to happen in some way. You have there a completely absurd setting in which children, small children aged from 0 to 3, have to see horrendous pictures. They starve, it's amazing the amount of harm that we are doing to these new generations of children that are growing up in these countries.
Exactly.
And this very painful reality, is being added on top of all the identity conflict that was there before. So, if you have an identity that is tied to the system of violence and that cuts you off your own capacity of empathy, then that becomes the dominant pattern. And that dominant pattern doesn't ask about your opinion, about your like and about your preferences. That pattern just replicates itself. So what we're facing right now is not easy to answer. It's a complex issue in which identity on one side and then globalization of values on the other side clash. They create a problem. And this is also something that is written in this paper that you are talking about, Kirk. I mean, you can read a sentence. I don't know on which page it is, but I'll just quote it to add a sentence about what I'm talking by this other author. The other author's name is Peter Sass, Peter S-A-S, Sass. And he writes, as a consequence, I see the so-called clash of civilizations between modernity and Islamic fundamentalism not as a clash between different cultures which are essentially alien to each other. Rather, I see that clash as an internal contradiction of modernity itself. And this is exactly what I'm explaining. This is where globalization on one side and identity clash together. Why? Because they're not compatible. And this is something where a link needs to be built. This is what we are doing in technical terms. This is why we're talking about peace and why we are talking about trauma in technical terms. We're not discussing it on the basis of morals. We're saying what we need to do is have more people capable of being empathic. Full stop.
That does make sense. I'm going to go to a question statement from one of our listeners. Marcelo wrote this a little while ago, so I'm just going to read what Marcelo wrote here. The self-contained state of constantly feeling there is no way out and that the individual reactions and opinions and acts are irrelevant not only make them lose hope, but make them live like in a pressure cook state. Imagine that means pressure cooker state, which sooner or later will manifest in violence at home, in the streets, and at school, in the office, or wherever. But it will finally come out in a non-peaceful and non-creative way. The fundamentalist countries you have named are good samples, but our societies are too. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly the point. I mean, we have fundamentalism that has been bred and that has been part of our identity in Europe at large. It's like we have had religions of wars for a long time. For example, first between pagan Romans and Christians. Then after that, among Christians, between those who thought that they were the right Catholics and those who were not the right Catholics, between a Pope in Rome and a Pope in France, then with a splitting church in England, and then we have had Protestantism and Catholicism facing each other. We have had some kind of fundamental religious wars that have led, for example, then to the existence of the United States, because if there hadn't been these religious wars, we wouldn't have had white people settling in the United States, and so on. It's an endless story. In the end, the fundamentalism that we have gone through in past times in Europe is simply echo. What we are receiving from Islam is the echo. Yeah, it's nothing else. I mean, we've produced it 100 years ago. We have a peaceful situation since 1945, but that's not enough. We have to make that last for at least another 2 generations, so 50 years more. This means that only at the end of 2065, and if we manage to keep Europe peaceful until then, we will be able to say that we are on a stable peace course, but we are not yet there, first. And second, we cannot do that alone. if we want peace to be the modus vivendi, so let's say the general rule applied to everybody on this planet, we have to make it accessible and available for everybody outside Europe. Yeah, it's not enough to have it in Europe. It's nonsense. Yeah, you cannot externalize permanently costs. So you cannot have predator capitalists making it comfortable in a comfort zone like Europe or the United States at the expenses of other regions of the planet where people earn $1 to $2 per day. No, sorry, that doesn't work. Makes no sense. And then at the cost of armies and at the cost of expenses in war equipment, which are completely destructive and completely absurd. You know, I mean, we don't need to go into that discussion, Kurt, but you know how little it costs to bring all children on planet into school and to have them fed every day in a sensible way in comparison to, for example, the expenses that, and we don't need to even name the United States, even though the United States spends most, you know, of the world's budget on armament and war industries, yeah? But let's take the budget that is produced every year by German population for war and armament industries. Yeah, let's take just that. If we just take that, I think that that budget alone would make and compensate for all the children on the planet to be able to go to school and to have a, you know, to be fed every day. So if that would be possible, and that is an abstract decision that needs to be made by politics, then it means that, you know, Europe and the United States, the so-called Western world, is simply a little bit cynical, a little bit hypocritic. You know, I mean, it's not very sincere. These wishes for peace are not sincere. That's what I would say, because if you put your heart to an issue and if you really want to live in peace, then you produce peace reality and you do not produce war reality. And what I see, for example, is that France has an economic crisis and Russia was about to buy some warships. And then suddenly happened something with Ukraine, and it is suddenly a problem to sell those warships to Russia. But then, you know, politics make it somehow that a reconciliation with Russia is on its way. Why? Well, one of the questions, obviously, is France needs the money. It needs the money. So if it can sell the warships, it will be happy. So let's lower the conflict level with Russia because it's interesting for our economy. We have some few thousand people and families living off that. And that is not sensible. That's not sensible, very simply. It's not a way to make politics. Yeah, that's opportunism at its lowest, dirtiest level. Yeah, and has nothing to do with politics as it should be.
Let me ask you a quick question here before we continue on. It looks like we're going to have to take another break before we open up the phone lines, so I guess we'll do it after the next commercial break, or the last one as it comes to be. I want to verify something with you, Andrés. I read this in the media in English, so I'm assuming it came from the United States. But just to question it, I think it was November or December, I read that Norway deported around 8,000 Muslims that they considered to be violent, I'll put it that way. Is that true? And if so, what has been if there is any feedback or backlash to that, and anything at all with Norway?
I wouldn't be able to make a statement about that. I have colleagues working in Norway, which I could ask. One of them, you know, being a famous peace advocate, and he's also on Facebook. I'm looking for the link so that I can send you his page. I am not able to look at every single conflict we have in Europe regarding these issues, and I'm really sorry, Kirk, but here I wish not to talk about something which I'm not deeply involved with.
I respect you for that.
Yeah.
No, I respect you for that. If you don't know, why bother to comment about it? Okay, let's do one more comment here from one of our listeners on the chat room. And after the break, if anyone wants to call in, we can call in. I'll give the number again before we go on the break. Fernando says, or asks a question actually, may not be, I'm going to just read it the way he wrote it, may not be more education, in other words, wouldn't it be better for more education, especially for women in traumatized countries, a good way out of violence?
Yeah, that is a good point, but I would say also that education needs to be a very specific and technical education. We educate people in these terms, and our education project is a very short one. It just takes 30 to 40 hours. That's all we need. So it's not an issue of quantity, again, it's an issue of quality. People are not stupid. Generally speaking, also victims of violence who are traumatized are intelligent enough to understand these concepts. They don't need to be hammered into the people like a brainwashing program. So if you address the right quality, you need a short lapse of time to create an awareness that is sufficient to change reality. And I say, and I would defy anybody stating something different, I would say that he doesn't know what he's talking about, that a teaching period of 30 to 40 hours is more than enough. It's all depending on whether you do a upfront teaching, for example, or it's an interactive learning in which people are involved in group dynamics. I would say that if we do some teaching, technical teaching about these issues with group dynamics, we could solve that question pretty quick. But again, this is something that needs the political approval of those who right now are frying all of us in their pan. And they have the pan by the handle, Kirk. I don't know how to, do it so that they let it go. This is where we need some triggers, and where I would be happy to have the media, participating like you are doing it.
Well, that's the whole reason for having the show here. So I hope, again, you'll be back again for another interview, part number 3. You pick the time, we'll do it from there. We're going to take a break here, our last break, and we'll be back in 1 minute and 15 seconds. So we'll continue on with our interview with Andrés Ginestet, and we will also open the phone and the Skype lines. Phone number is area code 347-677-0812. Once again, area code 347-677-0812. And if you're on the Blog Talk screen, there should be a Skype icon. Click on that. You can call in by Skype and follow the prompts, and you'll be in. We'll be right back after this break.
Hi, this is Lisa Avery, and I am with Sacred Introvert Retreat Tours. We're heading off to Glastonbury this May, and we hope you'll join us. So check it out, sacredintrovert.com. And I'm at K-Wave 6 Radio, and I'm feeling super honored and blessed to be here. Have a beautiful day.
Are you ready to put an end to thinking about how you wish it were and take action? Take this step to find out more by going to coachingbyria.com, and you can receive your free consultation session with Coach Ria. Coach Ria is a certified professional life coach with a passion to help make the difference in the world.
Hi, this is Al Sussman, the author of Changing Times, 101 Days That Shaped a Generation, published by Parading Press. And you're listening to the always interesting Kirk Spencer on K-Wave 6 Radio.
Hello and welcome back to K-Wave 6 Radio. This is Kirk Spencer. My guest today is Andrés Ginestet from Germany. almost went Alamania again there, Andres. Anyhow, we're back, and as I said, the phone lines are open, so if you want to call in or you want to leave a chat room message, by all means do so. Otherwise, we'll just continue on our conversation with Andres and me, and we'll see how this goes. Once again, the telephone number is area code 347-677-0812, or you can call in by Skype, by the Skype icon on the Blog Talk window for our show. I know it's early in the morning for the Americas, so you might be at work or whatever, but if whoever's out there wants to call in, please do call in. Anyway, Andres, let's see. I pretty much covered most of the questions that I wanted to talk about, so let's ask, you have a paper that I wanted to get into, and from the looks of it, it was actually an easy read. It was put in other words, easy read as being it was a short paper. Why is a human complexity, and I can't see the rest of the title here.
Why is a human being a complexity expression? Yeah. You mean that one? It's a 1 A4 page document which I have written just to clarify and to make things understandable. I mean, it's a paper that just discusses what is a human being, and a human being is a body and is a character. You know, a human being is somebody who has an identity, and because he has an identity, he does some things. And what I'm just explaining in this paper is that the body in itself is not important because it's borrowed matter, it's borrowed atoms. When a human person dies, the water within the body evaporates and then it falls down as rain. And as rain, it gets absorbed by plants, by animals, and by other human beings. So we are drinking, water which comes out of the bodies of those people who die around us. Yeah, and so what is dead about that? I mean, is that water, dead water, because it comes from dead bodies? Nonsense. Matter is not something that can live or die. Atoms do not live or die. So what happens is that this planet, everything we touch and we see, is completely immortal. It just transforms. It may have few more or few less bodies on it, so human bodies, let's say. The planet may have, instead of 7 billion people as we are now, 10 billion or 5 billion or 2 billion. But in the end, the amount of water on the planet remains the same. And the amount of calcium which is in our bones also remains the same. Maybe some of it gets lost in space because planet Earth travels through space, maybe. But then, planet Earth gets hit by meteors every day, and I don't know how many tons of dust from other planets is landing on the surface of our planet. But in the end, I do not think that planet Earth is, being a relatively closed system, is losing weight every time a human being dies. So what happens is that our bodies are completely immortal. They do not belong to us. They are borrowed from the substance of the planet itself. And the bodies exist to home a soul, to home what we are, our character, our way of being. And this is what shows most that we are not what we call ourselves humans, but that we are a behavioral pattern. Because the only thing that really dies when we die, the only thing that is lost forever, the only thing is that behavioral pattern. Our body is recycled 100%. It does not die. A molecule of water within our body does not die. It evaporates, it becomes rain, and it lives on. The only thing that really dies and disappears and is lost forever is our behavioral pattern, it's our character, is that what makes us unique. So the only thing that really dies is the soul. And this makes clear that the only thing that really lives is that soul, because only something that can die, that can disappear, is alive. If you cannot die, a molecule of water cannot die, so it's also not alive. It's just there. And the only reason why it appears in a human body is because a character needs to exist. And the reason why this character needs to exist is what makes then that body available. And this is why human species is growing at the expense of other species on the planet, borrowing of the planet what it needs to do so. But we are borrowing. And the question is when the planet is going to ask us to pay back first. Second, the question is what for? What is the reason for these species to develop in such a way? And here is where we have to become aware of the fact that a character is a relational pattern. So if we exist, it is because we communicate. And we communicate with outer space, we communicate with the planet, we communicate with our societies, we communicate with the animals, with the plants on the planet, we communicate with everything that is otherwise perceived as being alive. And this is what makes a huge difference between us human beings and a plant. Because we are able to say and to state that a plant is alive. The plant is not able to state or to say that we humans are alive. I actually don't think that a plant cares very much about whether we exist or not. So I suppose and I imagine that plants do not care about our existence. And we instead do care. So this is all about relations and putting into perspective, which means that in the end, human beings are relational patterns, and this is exactly what complexity is about. Complexity is nothing but the description of relations.
Okay, I would love to comment on that, but we've only got about 20 minutes to go. So I'm going to go with a message from Fernando once again. But I just want to reinstate that we have the phone lines open, so if anyone wants to call in, area code 347-677-0812, or click on the Skype icon and follow the prompts to call in. Fernando is asking, can you talk more about this short education program you propagate?
Okay, yes. I'll be happy to do so. We have created an educational program which is really easy to promote. It's something which requires a class of, let's say, 15 persons. We need 15 people in a group. Why? Because the educational program we runs on the interaction patterns between people. You know, as we take, it's an educational program about complexity, so complexity is involved, and the system of violence is involved, and we also explain the system of violence within that educational program. And we do it with a maximum of, let's say, 15 people per teacher. So we need small groups of people, and as what we explain is not very complicated, we think that if people go at the most 3 times through this educational pattern, that these people are then able to replicate the education themselves without falsifying it, which means that if people learn to first integrate the concepts that we are explaining and transmitting in the first setting, in the first teaching. They first learn to integrate it into their own lives. And then we add these people to the group of teachers, and we do the teaching with them 2 more times. That is more or less enough for them to be experts in that issue and to be able to give the same knowledge away to other people. And this is important because we have designed this teaching and this educational pattern in a way that enables for its self-replication. We do not want to play the same role that Christianity played, by using some patriarchal male authority that will implant some belief in and seed some belief in some people and creating a major system of belief, because we are practical, we are pragmatic. This is something which is bound to day-to-day life. We want to make it simple so that everybody can access it, and so that it does not suppose to create, huge and massive efforts. We do not want to confront societies with our beliefs. We want an evolution and not a revolution. So we build the knowledge into small patterns that are digestible, that are easy to take in. And what we discuss is how we can change day-to-day life patterns, integrating knowledge about emotions in the same way we integrate the knowledge itself into our lives. So in Western society, for example, the teaching system at schools is very much centered on rational education of knowledge and how to access knowledge, but it's all rational. And the emotional education is very limited. And what we do in our teaching courses is that we, for the first time for some people, because they were not aware of this reality, we make equally available emotional education. We explain how emotions work differently from ideas, and there are very simple notions for that. And these simple notions then allow to access the entire setting of emotions in a totally different way. We live through emotions and we grow with emotions, and emotions are one of the main ingredients of our character, of our behavioral patterns. Behavioral patterns are left, most of the times, they're left to themselves. They're left to family education. Like if family really was an expert in emotional manipulation. Well, I don't know, Kirk, what you would say about it. And, I know that family does a lot of emotional manipulation, but it's not an expert in doing it. There is a little difference in between some people doing something just out of nature and the way they have inherited, and people doing it because they have become aware that there could be changes, that this process could be an educated process. It's completely different. So I think that to be a family is a good thing. To be a member of a family is also a good thing, but that this is not the same as being an expert in emotional education. And then this emotional education, which gets balanced with the rational education, gets centered, around the concepts of the system of violence and complexity governance.
Sounds like we might have to do a whole show on just that, complexity. Because one of the things that you were... Go ahead.
We're discussing the term, off and on, but we could spend a lot of time, in describing how complexity affects our everyday life.
Sounds like a good title for our next show. Fernando, I think, is going to be a good follower for you. Fernando's asking another question here. He says, how do people who have participated in these teachings apply that in their life? Are there projects?
Oh, yes. right now we have a group of people who have participated in these teachings, and some of them are, for example, business leaders. So they have their own companies, and what they do, first thing they do is that they implement the same teaching with their employees, so that when they meet their employees, they all are talking the same language and they know what they are expecting of each other. Because nothing would be worse than having a totally frustrated manager of a company who knows a lot and does not know how to make it available to his own staff. Imagine what it's like, you would have somebody who's completely filled with light and with hope, and then goes out and faces gray tones in everyday life and faces, just some kind of very narrow-minded and closed minds which are not wishing or wanting to even discuss the subject. So we have then situations in which, for example, the people which are working with us are teachers at school. And they are then implementing the subject and introducing them in discussions in the everyday teaching in classes, and making the subjects of complexity and emotional education available to children. We have within that group engineers which work in major companies and which then suddenly, because they have gone through this education, start seeing how the entire company is not really working in a way that makes sense to them, because they have understood some critical issues about how a complex process can be driven to a nightmare and how it can become a paradise. As they know how to make the distinction, then they start working on small projects within their company and start introducing their colleagues to the notions and explaining why they would advocate for one or the other solution instead of what the company is running into. And this is just to tell you 3 examples of what kind of people we have in our courses and what we teach. And there are people of all ages and genders and classes. So we have women, we have men, we have women age 18, 19, 20. We have sometimes even children or adolescents, so boys who are 15 to 18. And we may have then people who are seniors, who are 60 and even older. And they all are perfectly able to participate in the same class and to interact. So the teaching itself does not make a gender biased or an age biased or a social class biased difference. You may be rich, you may be poor, you will understand the concepts, and you will be able to exchange and to apply the concepts in your day-to-day life. And then this changes really people's life. So we have had, for example, one company manager who, after learning what he learned with us, sold 80% of his company in order to be more free, to have some time for himself and to work more on the issues that we're working. And he's just changing his life slowly. He just sold his company, it just happened. And he's now struggling to make some more free time so that he can work for peace, let's say at least 1 to 2 days per week, and to do more of what we do. But this is all, voluntary. It's people's decisions, it's not ours. We do the teaching and that's all. Then we let people go and it's their life. They have to decide if they want a peaceful life or not. I think that it needs to be very clear that we cannot play a major role and carry long wooden crosses around on which we are going to be nailed like this happened in the past.
Yeah. Actually, you bring it down to the question I want to ask just as closing. It seems like, I guess, not too many people want to call in from Skype, or they're calling from America. There's probably it works. Anyway, let me ask you this, because you're getting to that point of where in that paragraph that we put up for the invitation, the end of that paragraph was talking about returning. Basically, I'm paraphrasing here big time. Is bringing back the ownership of. I'm going to use my own words here. Bringing back the ownership and leadership for our own communities and for the world. In other words, putting the complexity back on the people, because we are the ones who create the complexity anyway. We're not talking about governing agencies or anything along that line. And to use your last example of you teach, then you let them go, because as I tell people, you are the one responsible for your own life, whether you choose to follow somebody else's ideas or directives or to follow your own. The decision still remains on you, and there is no such thing as, well, he made me do it, she made me do it. No, you had the decision. You have the onus. The onus is on you to make a decision whether to follow somebody else or your own thoughts.
Yeah, exactly. That's, the most important point. I myself, I'm an artist on one side, so I'm used to create things and to be responsible for the consequences, because if I make, for example, a massive sculpture like the one which is in Dortmund, and then this creates a strike among a staff that has no allowance to make a strike, and this strike then gets known among state civil servants, and all the consequences, are really strong consequences. So, as an artist, I'm used to transform reality, to face what I do, to face the transformation which I create, because I obviously only bring a piece of art into a building, but it's a strong statement. If you want, it's comparable to what Charlie Hebdo, the French magazine, has done, depicting Mr. Mohammed and other people, and then, having this terrorist attack on it in Paris. They also are responsible people. They also use some artistical mean in this kind, of the kind of satirical drawing, and this satirical drawing then creates a conflict, and they put up with the consequences and say, we are gonna go on doing it. And after the terrorist attack, the first thing they do is publish on the front page a picture that then creates another wave of violence. And why? Because they are artists in some way. They are responsible for what they do, and they have chosen to go for what they go for. They know that there is going to be dead people because of that page. They know that it's going to be a further growing conflict, and they're doing it for a purpose, which I won't go into the reasons for why they are doing it. As a matter of fact, those people who are creative and artists in everyday life are mainly aware of what they're doing. They are mainly responsible for their actions. And then there is a huge amount of people who think that they can hide behind somebody else's authority. And there is one great German origin author, which I would like to quote for this, which is Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt wrote about the banality of evilness. She wrote on the analysis that she did of the Nazi criminals during the Nuremberg trials in Germany. There were, several thousands of German Nazi officers who were then caught and were sent to prison and went to trial in Nuremberg, and some of them were hung and killed, executed, and some of them were sentenced to life sentences in prison. And what Hannah Arendt discovered in the protocols of these trials was that all those people were perfectly capable of being kind, loving fathers to their own children, have a normal family, and just do a normal work. And for example, that normal work consisted in organizing some trains that sent some people into Auschwitz and Treblinka and other concentration camps. But that was just a work, and they just did their work the way it had to be done. They didn't have an opinion about it. They just did it. Yeah? And they created a monstrosity. They created a huge cruelty. And this is what Hannah Arendt calls the banality, the normality of the evil. Because it just, it's horrendous the way these people could split personalities and at home be peaceful fathers and then send millions of people into death camps and have them tortured to death, and it's just horrendous. So
yeah, Andrés, we're going to have to cut this short. So if you have maybe about 5 seconds.
Oh well, then I would say please let us go on doing some shows, because we need to go on talking about these issues, because this concept you've just addressed is essential, and we have not talked enough about it. We haven't. Yes, and you'll be back soon. I had some announcements, but I'm just going to say, remember that we have a time change coming up next week. We're going to be moving back 2 hours. So instead of coming on 9 Eastern, we'll be on at 11. Andrés, thank you. We will talk again about doing another show in the near future. And everyone, glad that you were here, and we hope to see you again soon. Take care and be well.